For 18 years, postal worker Eddie Martinez had walked the same route through the Oak Valley neighborhood, delivering mail with the reliability of Sunrise itself. But for the past 2 years, his unusual companion, a red squirrel named Nutkin, had been stealing letters from his mail bag and hiding them in secret locations around the neighborhood. Eddie thought it was just playful behavior until he discovered Nutkin's hidden collection of over 800 stolen letters. What the squirrel had been protecting in that collection would expose a conspiracy that had been stealing from elderly residents for years, and prove that sometimes the smallest guardians can uncover the biggest crimes. Eddie Martinez had been walking the Oak Valley Mill route for nearly 2 decades when he found Nutkin during a particular harsh winter storm 6 years earlier. The tiny red squirrel, barely old enough to survive on his own, had been clinging to a tree branch outside Mrs. Chen's house, too weak from cold and hunger to climb to safety. "Come here, little guy," Eddie had said, carefully scooping the shivering squirrel into his postal jacket. "You're not going to make it out here alone." Eddie had intended to take Nutkin to a wildlife rehabilitation center, but the squirrel had other plans. Within days, Nutkin had made himself at home in Eddie's garage, setting up a cozy nest in an old mail bag and demonstrating an unusual fascination with postal operations. "He acts like he wants to help deliver the mail," Eddie had told his wife, Roser, as they watched Nutkin organize scattered letters by size. "I've never seen a squirrel behave like this." What started as temporary care had evolved into an extraordinary partnership. Nutkin began accompanying Eddie on his daily routes, riding in a specially modified compartment of the mail truck and learning the rhythms of postal work. The red squirrel seemed to understand that mail delivery was serious business, and he took his role as Eddie's companion seriously. The residents of Oak Valley had quickly grown fond of the unusual mail team. Children would run out to see Nutkin, and elderly residents would save nuts and treats for the friendly squirrel who brightened their days. Nutkin seemed to recognize every house on the route and would often alert Eddie to unusual situations: packages left unattended, doors left open, or residents who seemed to need extra attention. "That squirrel's got better customer service skills than most postal workers," joked Martha Williams, the Oak Valley postmaster, after hearing stories of Nutkin's helpfulness. "Maybe we should put him on the payroll." For 4 years, Eddie and Nutkin had maintained a perfect partnership. The squirrel's presence had made Eddie's job more enjoyable and had brought smiles to countless residents. Nutkin had become something of a neighborhood celebrity, featured in the local newspaper and beloved by everyone who met him. But 2 years ago, Nutkin's behavior had begun to change in subtle ways that Eddie initially attributed to normal animal instincts. The first time Eddie noticed Nutkin acting strangely was on a Tuesday morning in October. 2 years earlier, they were delivering mail to Maple Street, where many of Oak Valley's senior residents lived in well-maintained houses with carefully tended gardens. Nutkin had always been particularly gentle around the elderly residents, seeming to sense their more fragile nature. But that morning, as Eddie sorted mail for Mrs. Eleanor Davidson's house, Nutkin had suddenly become agitated. The squirrel had chattered urgently and tried to grab a particular envelope from Eddie's hand, a piece of mail addressed to Mrs. Davidson from something called Senior Financial Services. "What's gotten into you, buddy?" Eddie had asked, gently moving Nutkin away from the mail. "This isn't a game." But Nutkin had persisted, following Eddie to Mrs. Davidson's mailbox and continuing to show interest in that specific letter. When Eddie had placed the mail in the box, Nutkin had positioned himself nearby, watching intently as if memorizing the envelope's appearance. Over the following weeks, Eddie had noticed that Nutkin was becoming increasingly selective about which pieces of mail caught his attention. The squirrel would ignore regular bills, personal letters, and advertisements, but would become animated whenever Eddie handled mail from financial service companies, insurance agencies, or legal firms. He's developed quite an interest in business correspondence. Eddie had mentioned to Roser during dinner one evening, "I don't understand it, but he seems to know which letters are important and which ones aren't." The situation had escalated when Nutkin began actually taking letters. It started small. Eddie would notice that an envelope had shifted position in his mailbag, or that a piece of mail he was certain he had sorted was missing when he reached a delivery address. Initially, Eddie had assumed he was making mistakes. After 18 years of mail delivery, the routine had become so automatic that he sometimes questioned his own memory. But when he began paying closer attention, he realized that Nutkin was systematically removing specific types of mail from his delivery bag. "Nutkin's been stealing letters," Eddie had told Rosa after catching the squirrel red-handed with an envelope in his mouth. "I watched him take a letter addressed to Mr. Peterson from some financial company I've never heard of." Eddie had tried various strategies to prevent the theft, securing his mail bag more carefully, keeping Nutkin in the truck during deliveries, even leaving the squirrel at home on certain days. But Nutkin had proven remarkably persistent and resourceful, finding ways to access mail even when Eddie thought he had taken adequate precautions. The situation had become embarrassing when residents began asking about missing mail. Mrs. Davidson had called the post office to report that she hadn't received an expected letter from her insurance company. Mr. Peterson had inquired about a financial document that should have arrived weeks earlier. Eddie had been forced to request replacement copies of mail, claiming delivery errors. "I don't understand what's gotten into him," Eddie had confided to Martha Williams. "Nutkin's never been destructive or mischievous before, but lately he's been taking specific types of mail, and I can't figure out why." Martha had suggested that Nutkin might be hoarding instinctively, preparing for winter by collecting materials for nest building. But Eddie knew this wasn't normal squirrel behavior. Nutkin was being selective about which mail he took, and he seemed to be following some kind of pattern that Eddie couldn't decipher. The mystery had deepened when Eddie had discovered that Nutkin wasn't eating the stolen mail or using it for nesting material. The squirrel was taking the letters somewhere and leaving them intact. But despite Eddie's best efforts to follow Nutkin and discover his hiding places, the clever squirrel had managed to keep his activities secret. After 18 months of trying to understand and prevent Nutkin's mail theft, Eddie had reached a breaking point. The squirrel had become increasingly bold in his activities, sometimes taking multiple letters in a single day. The complaints from residents were mounting, and Eddie was facing potential disciplinary action from the Postal Service. "I love that squirrel-like family," Eddie had told Roser, "but I might have to stop bringing him on my routes. His behavior is putting my job at risk." Rosa had suggested a different approach. "Instead of trying to stop him, why don't you try to understand what he's doing? Maybe there's a reason for his behavior that we haven't considered." That suggestion had led Eddie to begin documenting Nutkin's activities more systematically. He had started keeping detailed records of which letters Nutkin took, noting the senders, recipients, and types of correspondence that attracted the squirrel's attention. The patterns that emerged had been both fascinating and troubling. Nutkin was almost exclusively targeting mail from financial services companies, legal firms, and insurance agencies, particularly those addressing elderly residents. He showed no interest in personal letters, utility bills, or standard commercial advertising. "It's like he's conducting some kind of investigation," Eddie had observed to Roser as they reviewed his notes. "He's not taking mail randomly. He's being very specific about what he considers important." Eddie had also noticed that Nutkin's behavior varied depending on the sender and recipient of mail. Letters from well-known, established companies were generally ignored, while mail from firms that Eddie didn't recognize often caught Nutkin's immediate attention. The breakthrough had come on a Saturday morning when Eddie had decided to follow Nutkin secretly after the squirrel had taken a letter addressed to Mrs. Davidson from a company called Golden Years Financial Planning. Eddie had pretended to continue his route while actually tracking Nutkin from a distance. What he had discovered had amazed him. Nutkin had taken the stolen letter to a carefully concealed location in the woods behind the Oak Valley Community Center, where he had added it to what appeared to be a massive, organized collection of mail. There must be hundreds of letters there, Eddie had whispered to himself, watching from behind a tree as Nutkin methodically sorted the stolen mail into different piles. He's been doing this for 2 years. The discovery had raised more questions than it answered. Why was Nutkin hoarding these specific letters? How had he developed such sophisticated organizational skills? And most importantly, what was he trying to protect or preserve? Eddie had waited until Nutkin left the area before approaching the hidden collection. What he had found there would change everything he thought he knew about his pet squirrel and would uncover a conspiracy that had been operating under his nose for years. The scale of Nutkin's secret operation had taken Eddie's breath away. Hidden beneath a carefully constructed shelter of branches and leaves, the red squirrel had assembled the most comprehensive collection of suspicious mail that Eddie had ever seen. Over 800 letters were organized into neat piles, sorted by sender and recipient with a precision that rivaled any filing system. As Eddie had examined the collection more closely, he had begun to understand the intelligence behind Nutkin's activities. The squirrel hadn't been stealing mail randomly. He had been building a case file. Every letter in the collection was from a financial services company, legal firm, or insurance agency that Eddie didn't recognize. Many were addressed to elderly residents of Oak Valley, and they all shared common characteristics: urgent language, requests for personal information, demands for immediate payment, or offers that seemed too good to be true. My God, Eddie had whispered as he read through letter after letter. These are all scams. The letters revealed a sophisticated fraud operation targeting Oak Valley's senior citizens. Companies with official-sounding names like Senior Financial Services, Golden Years Planning, and Elder Care Insurance were sending convincing correspondence designed to steal personal information, money, or both. One letter addressed to Mrs. Davidson claimed that her Social Security benefits were about to be discontinued unless she provided her Social Security number and banking information within 48 hours. Another letter to Mr. Peterson offered a limited-time investment opportunity that promised unrealistic returns, but required an immediate wire transfer of $5,000. Eddie had pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the letters, his hands shaking as he realized the magnitude of what Nutkin had uncovered. The squirrel had been protecting Oak Valley's elderly residents by preventing fraudulent mail from reaching them. He knew, Eddie had said aloud, looking around for Nutkin, who was watching from a nearby tree. Somehow, you knew these letters were dangerous. The evidence in Nutkin's collection suggested that the fraud operation was extensive and well organized. The scam letters used sophisticated techniques to appear legitimate: official letterheads, government-style language, and references to real programs and agencies. Without careful examination, they would be convincing to anyone, especially elderly individuals who might be more trusting of official-looking correspondence. Eddie had spent 3 hours documenting Nutkin's collection, photographing every letter and making notes about the patterns he observed. The fraud operation seemed to be targeting specific demographics: residents over 65, people living alone, and individuals who might have significant savings or fixed incomes. As he had worked, Eddie had been amazed by the sophistication of Nutkin's organizational system. The squirrel had somehow learned to recognize the characteristics of fraudulent mail and had developed methods for intercepting and preserving it as evidence. You've been conducting a 2-year investigation, Eddie had told Nutkin, who had climbed down from his tree to sit beside his human partner. You've been protecting our neighbors, and I had no idea. The discovery had left Eddie with a crucial decision. The evidence Nutkin had collected could potentially save Oak Valley's elderly residents from financial ruin, but presenting it would require explaining how a squirrel had assembled a comprehensive case file against a criminal organization. Eddie had spent a sleepless night deciding how to handle Nutkin's incredible discovery. By morning, He had concluded that protecting Oak Valley's elderly residents was more important than avoiding occult explanations about his pet squirrels. Detective work. His first call had been to Martha Williams at the post office. "Martha, I need to report a major mail fraud operation, and I need you to trust me when I tell you how I discovered it." The conversation that followed had been one of the strangest in Postal Service history. Eddie had explained Nutkin's 2-year investigation, the hidden collection of fraudulent letters, and the evidence of systematic targeting of elderly residents. Martha's initial skepticism had given way to amazement as Eddie had shown her the photographs of Nutkin's collection. "Eddie, there are over 800 pieces of mail here. If even half of these scams have been successful, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses." The postal inspector who had arrived the afternoon had been equally incredulous until he had examined the evidence Nutkin had collected. Inspector James Rodriguez, no relation to Eddie, had 20 years of experience investigating mail fraud, and he had never seen such a comprehensive collection of evidence assembled by anyone, let alone by a squirrel. "This is remarkable," Inspector Rodriguez had said as he reviewed the organized piles of fraudulent mail. "Your squirrel has identified patterns and connections that our investigators might have missed. He's essentially been conducting surveillance on a criminal operation." The investigation that followed had revealed the full scope of the fraud conspiracy. The letters Nutkin had collected were part of a coordinated campaign by a criminal network operating across multiple states. The fraudsters had been using lists of elderly residents purchased from data brokers, targeting vulnerable individuals with increasingly sophisticated scams. "Based on the evidence your squirrel collected, we estimate that this operation has stolen over $2 million from elderly victims across 6 states," FBI Special Agent Maria Santos had explained to Eddie during the investigation. "Nutkin's collection provided us with the proof we needed to identify the perpetrators and understand their methods." The arrests that followed had dismantled the entire criminal network. 7 individuals were charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, and elder abuse. The ringleader was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while other members of the conspiracy received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. More importantly, the investigation had prevented countless additional victims from falling prey to the scams. The fraudulent companies were shut down, their assets seized, and their mailing lists destroyed. We estimate that Nutkin's intervention prevented at least $500,000 in additional losses, Agent Santos had said during a press conference announcing the arrests. "This squirrel literally saved dozens of elderly residents from financial ruin." The story of Nutkin's detective work had captured national attention. News outlets across the country had reported on the crime-fighting squirrel who had exposed a major fraud operation through his systematic collection of evidence. But for the residents of Oak Valley, Nutkin's actions had a more personal significance. Mrs. Davidson, Mr. Peterson, and dozens of other elderly residents had been protected from scams that could have cost them their life savings. "I had no idea those letters were trying to steal from me," Mrs. Davidson had said during a neighborhood gathering to honor Nutkin. "If that little squirrel hadn't stolen my mail, I might have lost everything I worked my whole life to save." In the months following the exposure of the fraud conspiracy, Nutkin had become something of a celebrity. The red squirrel had been featured in documentaries, interviewed by news programs, and had even received commendations from law enforcement agencies. But Eddie had been careful to protect Nutkin from excessive attention, ensuring that his fame didn't interfere with their daily routine or the squirrel's well-being. "He's still the same squirrel who just wants to help deliver the mail and take care of his neighbors," Eddie would tell reporters. The Postal Service had officially recognized Nutkin as an honorary mail security officer, the first animal to receive such recognition. The local post office had even installed a small plaque honoring Nutkin's service to the community. The investigation had also led to significant changes in how postal authorities handle suspicious mail. Targeting elderly residents, the Nutkin protocol had been developed as a framework for identifying and investigating potential mail fraud operations, incorporating many of the patterns that the squirrel had recognized instinctively. What Nutkin taught us is that mail fraud often follows predictable patterns, Inspector Rodriguez had explained. By training postal workers to recognize these patterns, we can identify and stop fraud operations before they victimize vulnerable populations. The case had also sparked scientific interest in animal intelligence and pattern recognition. Researchers had studied Nutkin's methods, trying to understand how a squirrel had developed such sophisticated investigative skills. Nutkin demonstrated abilities we rarely see even in highly trained human investigators. Dr. Patricia Kim, an animal cognition researcher, had observed his ability to recognize patterns, organize evidence, and take protective action shows intelligence that goes far beyond what we typically expect from animals. 6 months after the fraud ring's exposure, Eddie and Nutkin had returned to their normal mail delivery routine. But their relationship had been forever changed by the discovery of Nutkin's secret investigation. I always knew Nutkin was special, Eddie had reflected, watching his partner organize mail in their truck. But I never imagined he was capable of conducting a 2-year investigation to protect our neighbors. He taught me that intelligence and loyalty come in forms we don't always recognize. The fraud case had been closed, the criminals sentenced, and the victims compensated from seized assets. But Nutkin's vigilance had continued. The red squirrel still paid attention to unusual mail, though his interventions had become less necessary as postal authorities implemented better screening process. Years, Oak Valley's elderly residents had remained grateful for their unlikely protector. Many had started leaving special treats for Nutkin, and some had requested that Eddie and his partner personally deliver their mail. Trusting the squirrel's instincts to keep them safe, Nutkin saved our community, Mrs. Davidson had said during a ceremony marking the first anniversary of the fraud investigation. He proved that heroes come in all sizes, and that sometimes the most important protection comes from friends who can't speak but care enough to act. The story of Nutkin's investigation had become a symbol of the power of loyalty, intelligence, and the willingness to protect others regardless of personal risk. The red squirrel had shown that justice could come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the smallest voices could expose the biggest crimes. Eddie and Nutkin's partnership had continued, stronger than ever, bound by the shared experience of uncovering and stopping a conspiracy that threatened their community's most vulnerable members. Their story had proven that loyalty and intelligence transcend species, and that the most effective law enforcement sometimes comes with a bushy tail and an unshakable commitment to protecting those who can't protect themselves. In the end, Nutkin hadn't just saved Oak Valley's elderly residents from financial fraud. He had demonstrated that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important investigations are conducted by those who work without recognition, driven only by an instinct to protect and serve their community.